livecast. Welcome to the show. Boom, boom, boom. Livecast. Welcome to the livecast. I hope that has been enough preamble. We get all the annoying preamble banter out of the way first of all, just while I sing to you. That's how we roll in Lockdown 2. And joining me, I'm Glen Scrivener, if we haven't met before. And joining me in Crowborough, it is the wonderful
Paul Feasy, still here.
Still here. Even though, Lockdown 2, I'm finding it to be the diet cola of lockdown, you know.
Yeah. It doesn't really feel like a lot's changed, if I'm honest, going into second lockdown. You know, the kids are just doing everything on Zoom. That's it again. The kids are still in school, which is a blessing. But yeah, apart from that, doesn't feel... It's not as exciting as the first one. It's a letdown, you know, the sequels go.
It is. It's just 1 calorie, not locked down enough.
No.
Brandon John Kameny has some kind of emoji. Hello. It seems to me. Let me take a closer look at this.
What is that?
What are you doing? Is that a rude sign? Is that a gingerbread man?
I did wonder whether it was a jelly baby giving us the finger, but I think it's a thumbs up.
It kind of looks like a jelly baby.
Can we see that on the screen? Like, can we get that on here? Like,
No, we can't. We can't do that. Because I am by myself. I'm all by myself here in the Eastbourne studio, and this is one of the things that lockdown has meant, and so we're a little bit undercooked on the technological side of things, but we'll figure it all out. Oh yeah, Paul, go on. You need to speak as you put this up so that the camera will be on you.
What am I putting up?
The emoji.
Oh, sorry. I thought we'd done that. Like, I thought we'd already done that bit. Okay, here it is. I can't quite. It's not. You're not going to get a good enough picture to see what's going on there.
Brandon has just commented, and he's saying it's a first pump, and then he corrected it to fist pump.
Yeah, first pump.
Hey, thank you, Brandon. Lovely to have your company. Now, today we are talking about the power of story in the grip of suffering. Because we've been talking about suffering a little bit in our Reset series. If you guys haven't been following, do subscribe to us and like our channel and click the bell, and you will get these interviews in which we are going back to the beginning, back to Genesis, to figure out the origin story that has built our world. And we're going backwards from Cain and Abel in Genesis 4, back through Genesis 3, Genesis 2, Genesis 1, all the way back to in the beginning, God. And on the weekend, we had Wendy Alsup on the channel, and she is someone who really has struggled with a whole bunch of different suffering. We've entitled her interview "A Long Hard Road," because she's spoken about the long hard road of suffering. But even as we talk about a long hard road, we are talking in storied terms. You know, she is using an analogy. And it's a deeply scriptural analogy. It's the, walking through the valley of the shadow of death. It's a long, hard road, but built into that kind of concept is that we are heading somewhere and there is a destination, even if the journey is long and hard. And what we're going to talk about today is the way in which we can't escape telling stories of our suffering. And the way to get through suffering is to tell better stories, the stories that the scriptures give to us. But before we dive down into that kind of stuff, we often check out the mailbag. Is there anything in the mailbag, Paul, to have a look at?
Well, in all the confusion of trying to get this sorted, I haven't had a chance to look at the mailbag. But let me tell you, the comments we were getting all the comments, the best comments. No one's had better comments than us. Like, yeah,
fantastic,
beautiful comments.
Beautiful comments. We won the comments by a lot. By a lot.
Yeah, no idea what you're referencing there. No idea.
We're not going to get into that, are we? Not today.
No. We're going to let the dust settle on that one at least. So
it's not done. It's not done yet, people. After 2000, it was 34 days, I think, before Election Day and the time when Al Gore conceded to George W. Bush. I think 34 days. So
yeah, I think this could run a bit longer. I have a feeling.
If 2020 is anything to go by, and if the fact that I read something that like both sides have about 600 lawyers like primed and ready to go to fight these battleground states in the courts Yeah, yeah. So, like on the one hand, we were thinking, should we be timely, Paul, and talk about this urgent issue of the elections? And like,
No, we thought,
oh,
no, run for cover.
absolutely. So instead, we thought that we'd talk about the long hard road of suffering instead.
It was better to talk about the question of suffering. That was much easier to cope with than the US election.
Long hard road, which is itself a long hard road. But we're talking about not only the long hard road of suffering, we are also talking about story and the ability of story to see us through the long hard road of suffering. And one of the things that tipped us onto this subject of story was interviewing Tom Holland a few weeks ago on Reset. And he had a fascinating way of describing the coming to faith, or whatever faith journey Tom Holland is on. He's basically saying, look, I have given up on the anemic stories of liberal Western values, and I'm going back to the original roots of those stories, the original roots of those values, which are the Christian stories. And he talks about surrendering to the story. So what I thought I'd do is play a little clip of Tom Holland talking about surrendering to the story. And let's see if this is going to work. Zoom audio device. You know what? It sounds like none of our clips are going to work because we just transferred.
It's just one of those days today, isn't it?
We've just transferred to a new computer, and now it's saying you'd need to have installed the Zoom drivers in order for that audio to work.
Oh.
So who does a better Tom Holland impression, Paul? You or me?
I was going to say, yeah, we're going to have to go down that road, aren't we? Like, hang on. I've got a clip. I could do it.
Okay. Well,
I might be able to do it.
I'll make you co-host.
I mean, it's not impossible that this could work.
But do you have the clips? I didn't.
Well, I've got a bit of a Tom Holland clip.
Do you?
Yeah.
That'd be quite cool. That'd be quite cool. I'd have to make you into a host.
I mean, it's a shortened version of what he said, maybe, but
yeah,
you know, it's good. This is nice and professional. It's good.
On the hoof. We on the hoof. On the top chat, Chris Watts has said, "Good afternoon, Screezy."
Screezy, is that what we've become now?
It sounds like a portmanteau of our two names.
Tell you what I should do is I should open this video before I try and share it, shouldn't I? That would be even better.
Tell you what, this clip better be worth it. It's a long, hard road, people. This episode about suffering.
The road is long. Right, here we go. We've got the video is at least open on my computer now, so we're going to give this a go and see what happens. It might be mind-bogglingly loud because the volume, there's always a disparity, so we'll see. Here we go. Here's Tom.
That because I now understand where my beliefs and values came from, that rather than just drown completely beneath a kind of despair, I can cling to that. Ultimately, the power of Christianity is expressed most potently through its stories, and those stories are not just in the New Testament, but in what Christians call the Old Testament as well. And those stories don't have to be literally true. So the Exodus doesn't have to be literally true for the story itself, in my opinion, to be true. So I think that certain stories have such a power that you can surrender to them. And so essentially that's what I feel that I'm doing, is that I've surrendered to the truth of the stories, and therefore of the kind of the poetry and the mythology that they express. And I'm happy to identify myself with the truth of those stories and to see them as true in a kind of a moral, a poetic, a mythical sense.
There you go. That's all I got.
That's good. That's what I had as well. Brilliant. Yeah. So yeah, an interesting way of thinking about faith, I think. And sometimes you get pushback and people are like, no, it's not stories, they're actually true. Whereas Tom was talking about the truth of the stories, and he clearly seems to think that they are both truthful and powerful, such that he needs to surrender to them. So he's not using stories in the sense of little distractions, little illustrations to distract you. They are not distractions. They are the power that has built the world. Like the reason why we think of human rights and human equality and humanism, and the reason why we believe in liberty and freedom and all these kind of notions and ideals, these liberal values, is because of stories. Stories really have built the modern world, and they are very robust things. They are things that demand not only for us to listen to them, but for us to actually surrender to them. So like power, stories are an incredibly powerful thing, right?
Yeah. And I mean, we see that. I mean, we know that in our everyday lives, don't we? I mean, we're consumed by story generally. Not only our own story, but think how much time we spend just absorbed in some series, some narrative that we want to hear,
right,
that we can escape to. But then even in the Bible, I mean, the Bible is full of story, isn't it? And I don't just mean there are the stories of the events that happened, but you think of things like David and Bathsheba, and actually how is David convicted of what he has done in that? It's through Nathan, who comes, Nathan the prophet, and comes and tells him a story, which is there in 2 Samuel 12. And should I read some of this?
Do. Yeah, it's fascinating.
So if you've got your Bibles, it's in 2 Samuel 12, and at verse 1 it says, "The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, 'There were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children, shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who'd come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who'd come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, 'As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity.' Then Nathan said to David, 'You are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house, the master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what's evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own.'"
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, we see that. I mean, Nathan tells his story, and it's very, very cleverly done, isn't it? That, of course, David's reaction to it is to be outraged by it. And then Nathan just very cleverly just says, "Well, actually, you're that guy, aren't you? This is you." And it really kind of just brings David down to earth with a bump, doesn't it, from where he's at?
Right. Which is, brings David down with a bump, because like he has been living in fantasy land. What's fascinating is that it's David who's been living in Fantasyland. He didn't think he was living in Fantasyland. He just thought he was the king and he could do whatever he liked. But that was the story. That was the make-believe story. That was the fantasy. That was the lie that David was living out of. So how do you convict David of the lie? You tell a made-up story that is more true than the fantasy that David is living out of. And the fantasy story that Nathan invents is a made-up story that ends up immersing David in the truth. I just think that's really fascinating. David thinks he's doing this real-world, gritty, worldly thing, whereas actually he's in fantasy land. Nathan tells a made-up story in order to confront David with the truth of the matter. And sometimes people kind of like say, "Oh, you can't just be into telling stories all the time." Like if you're a preacher, for instance, don't tell a whole bunch of stories, because that's just manipulative and you're just tugging at heartstrings, which isn't fair. But what's Nathan doing?
Mm. And I
You
mean,
know?
I have a feeling there's probably someone else in scripture who used stories.
Yeah, that's right. He's good. Yeah, famously.
What's his name now? Just
Just this idea that, yeah, I mean, in Nathan's story, it's a little ewe lamb, not just a ewe lamb, it's a little ewe lamb that was like a daughter to him, right? If that's not tugging at the heartstrings, he goes to sleep with it in his arms. Are you picturing the scene? Nathan is totally laying it on thick. And this idea that, oh, we should never do that, when we're communicating the gospel, because that would be manipulative. Well, like, only if you think that the human person is just a brain on a stick and that we are just rational individuals who calmly assess the data. If that's your view of the human person, then I guess bringing emotion into things is illegitimate. But if you think that we are actually heart-led creatures, then like you're showing up to a gunfight with a knife, right? If you're trying to communicate with the human person and you're not using rhetoric and emotion and story, yeah, you're showing up with a knife to a gunfight. And as you say, Jesus quite famously tells stories. I mean, one of the interesting places I always think of in this is in Luke chapter 10. There's this expert in the law who stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And of course, the first thing Jesus does is ask a question back, which is very good evangelistic practice. Yeah, well done, Jesus. Gold star for you, right? So he answers questions with questions, and then when the man wanted to justify himself, in reply, Jesus said, verse 30, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, where he fell into the hands of robbers. And he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, which again is a story that's tugging at the heartstrings. And so he tells this story of the man who is descending from Jerusalem to Jericho, which was physically a huge descent because, Zion was this mountaintop city and Jericho was kind of right at the lowest point geographically in the land. And it's, due east of Jerusalem. So he's falling and he falls further into the hand of thieves and he's dead. So, a man goes from the heavenly city east of that Edenic paradise. He falls and he's left for dead. What are we meant to think about this story? And then these, the law comes past, the priest and the Levite representing, the power of the law. Can the law save a fallen man? No. Does a beautiful stranger save the fallen man? Yes, by pouring oil and wine, which is always symbolizing the oil and the spirit. The oil is the spirit and the wine is the blood. And somehow this beautiful stranger, heals and saves the man. And then Jesus says, who was a neighbor to the man who fell among thieves? So, like, who's the lawyer, who's the teacher of the law meant to put himself into the sandals of? He's meant to put himself into the sandals of the fallen man, the man left for dead, who is saved by a beautiful stranger. And then Jesus says, now that you've understood you've been saved by a beautiful stranger, go and do likewise. So he tells this story and he does exactly what Nathan does to David. He tells the story and then he places the hearer into a surprising pair of sandals. He wasn't expecting to be put into that pair of sandals. But all of a sudden, oh, in this world, I'm the fallen man and I need a Samaritan to save me. Now go and do likewise. And so again, he's immersing someone in the story in order to show him actual reality. But that's not the way that we tend to think of stories, is it, Paul? Like we tend to think of stories as like the sweetener, and then there's the bitter pill of the truth that you really need. Yeah, it's the fluff. Like
yeah. And I think it's easy to understand why we might think that. But if you think of something like 2 Corinthians 10, in verse 4 talks about the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of God. There's this sense, isn't there, that actually out there in the world has its stories already, its imaginations and strongholds, and actually our job is to is to tear those down, not through the warfare with the sword, but at least in part, through telling a different story.
Right. Right.
Which in itself, so we're telling a different story, but also that story itself may well be illustrated by more stories as well.
Right. Because even in the Nathan story, he's using a metaphor, an analogy. There is this ewe lamb that's like a daughter to him, and Jesus just layers on this analogical meaning like thick and fast. So there's that time where he says, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves, so be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. Like, it's a whole menagerie, isn't it? It's like you're a sheep among wolves, so be wise as serpent and innocent as doves, and
as guileless as a giraffe, and
strength of the bear, feet of the wolf, ears of the puma. It's like, but we hear that through kind of Western ears, and we sort of think, oh, Jesus, you're mixing your metaphors there. To which the Lord of the universe says, yeah, why don't you? Like, maybe we should copy Jesus. He layers on the stories, layer after layer. And Brandon in the comments has said, Jonathan Pageau's There's No Such Thing as Literal Meaning video comes to mind. Yeah, Jonathan Pageau is very interesting. He's an iconographer, an Orthodox guy in Canada, brilliant YouTube channel.
Explain for those of us who are not super brains what an iconographer is.
Someone who makes icons. So within the Orthodox tradition, icons are very, very important. You sort of meditate, God mediates his existence to us, his reality to us, through Christ, the image, and through creation, which has images of the image. And they are very into icons. And he carves icons, and he, through graphic design and carving, he makes those sorts of stuff. But on his channel, he very often talks about story, and he will analyze, the stories that Hollywood are telling through kind of Christian spectacles, and he will analyze the culture through the stories that the Bible is telling us. So, he's often saying things like the literal meaning. It's sort of in a sense, there is no literal meaning of the story. The deepest meaning of the story is the most profound one. We often think that the deepest meaning of a story is, what does this refer to? And if the thing that it refers to cannot be put under a microscope, then we haven't yet reached the literal meaning. Whereas, I think we're living within a story, and the most profound things about this world are storified. And Brandon sort of says there's no such thing as a story told that doesn't communicate a purpose, and the purpose is more important than the literal truth. And Brandon goes on to say, I say that as one who believes that the Bible is historical. So we believe that the Bible does have these historical truths to it, but it's not like you haven't understood the story until you get it down into something you can put under a microscope or dissect and scientifically examine. Maybe so like with with the Good Samaritan, is the most important question to ask about the story of the Good Samaritan, did that really happen? Show me the evidence. If there are 2 or 3 witnesses who can, testify in court that there was indeed such a Samaritan, I've never read of that, and I will not believe this story until you produce evidence.
I mean, who's ever heard of a Good Samaritan?
Right. And that's exactly the kind of prejudice that Jesus was playing on.
Wild tale. Fake news. Fake news.
It must be. But it's the kind of news that's built the world. And this is what Tom Holland is kind of talking about, the power of story. Now, I think someone like Paul van der Klee is good at saying, look, if it is true with a capital T, then it is true at every level of analysis, including the historical. So if the resurrection is true, then yes, it means that spiritually there's hope beyond suffering and the grave. Yes. It also, because it is the truth of all truths, it is true at every level of analysis, including the historical truth that Jesus actually got up out of that Jerusalem tomb, never to die again. And so the pathway is not necessarily, let's establish the historical truth of the resurrection, and then maybe lay it up on top of that, we can get to some kind of metaphorical meaning that we can live by. It's living into and leaning into the story, and at some stage acknowledging that this story really is true with a capital T, and therefore I think the tomb was empty.
What do you think it, like, just out of interest, what do you think it looks like for people who, because there must be people who would say that the story has this truth in it that I want to lean into, but I don't necessarily think the stories are literally true. I mean, what do you want to say to those people?
If you are really to lean into those stories, what it really means is that you in Christ and with Christ and like Christ, you pour out your life for the other, and you don't do the self-protection thing, and you love others though it cost you your life. So if you really lean into this story, if you're really captivated by the beauty of Easter, and you think it's a beautiful story, love came down, love poured itself out for the beloved, no matter what the cost was, and trusted somehow that there'd be a happily ever after. That's the sort of the metaphorical meaning that you take from Easter. Okay, I want to live into that story. Well, that means that when I'm faced with enemies, I need to turn the other cheek and love them. And even though they kill me, yet I offer them peace, right? Well, that's going to cost you. That's going to cost you in real world terms. And I think the only way that you can then lean into that story is to believe that in real world terms, you will be raised up at the end of this process. Because if you don't think, there was a back and forth on Twitter during lockdown, actually in June. There are a bunch of sort of armed militias that were guarding statues in the States, and especially there was this militia that was guarding a kind of a statue of Christ, and everything in the statue was white. So, I mean, the cross itself was white and Jesus was white. It was made out of white stuff, right? And but they had a tip off that this was going to get toppled because white Jesus, right? And so this picture went around social media of this armed militia with like 6 guys with automatic weapons, kind of armed to the teeth, with like belts of bullets over their shoulders, right? Underneath Christ with his arms outstretched to the world. And I just retweeted that image and just said, "Forgive them, Father. They know not what they do." Because here's the story of loving your enemies to death and not living by the sword. And people want to protect that story with a whole bunch of automatic weapons. So I tweeted that out, but then somebody came back at me and said, "You're being naive. The forces that would topple that statue will not stop, and they will shoot you." And then one person tweeted at me a picture of under Mao, soldiers making peasants dig ditches before they shot them in the back of the head. And I was sent this image of people with guns, and the implication was, this is where it leads. If you allow armed people to do this thing, this is where it leads. Are you willing to be that peasant and to play the whole pacifist card? And I had to think long and hard, because actually, like, convictionally, because of the Easter story, I think it is better to be the peasant than the person with the gun in that picture. And the story would tell me it's better to be the peasant getting shot than it is to be the revolutionary shooting. If that's the case, you really need to believe that if you're the peasant getting shot in the back of the head, you'll be raised up again at the end of it. Like, you really, if it comes to that level of imitating Christ and pouring yourself out, that's when you get into the territory of 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul says, if Christ wasn't raised from the dead, we are to be pitied more than all people. He's saying it to people who are flagging in their Christian devotion, and he ends the chapter by saying, therefore, let us give ourselves fully to the work. But as you give yourself fully to the work, you need to believe that resurrection is not just a nice story that will get you into the sacrificial position. You need to believe that resurrection is the kind of story that will raise you up even once you've made the sacrifice. Something like that, I think I'd say.
Yeah. It's helpful.
But yeah, so I mean, what's interesting is that I'm meeting more and more people who they kind of say, yeah, the story of Christ is the greatest story. I don't think it actually happens. I don't believe in resurrection, and therefore I'll live my life by that story, but I don't think it's true. Whereas I think you just can't lean yourself into that story fully unless you think it's true at every level, including the resurrection bit of it. At this stage, we were going to play for you Wendy Alsup clips, but I'm not sure we're going to be able to do that. But let me just describe a couple of the things that we talked about with Wendy Alsup. In the description of this video, you'll see a link to the interview that she gave us on Friday night. And what was fascinating to me is that we couldn't talk about suffering without talking about stories. And so we talked about the story of the perfection of creation at the beginning. We spoke about the story of the fall. We talked about the story of Job, and we talked about the story of Lazarus. And actually, we couldn't talk about any elements of the suffering that she's gone through. She's gone through a heck of a lot of suffering. All sorts of diseases coming all at once, and a divorce that she didn't want, and just calamity after calamity was befalling her. But she couldn't make sense of any of that except as regards to those stories. And I wonder, Paul, as we think about those 4 stories, Eden, fall, Job, and Lazarus, what help is it to have a story in the Bible that's, full of paradise and a Garden of Eden and everything's hunky-dory? Like, what benefit does it have to think about that story?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, it comes up relatively early on, doesn't it? I think in your discussion that you're talking about this, and that some people would say, well, doesn't it seem very, very cruel to have, this Garden of Eden kind of situation set up where everything is, God says this is not just good, it's very good, and there's this harmonious kind of thing, and almost a picture of life minus the pain and the suffering, living kind of in relationship with God, walking with God in the garden. And actually, I think what Wendy says, which was quite helpful, is that the Eden story kind of helps us to well, she said it. I think the word she used was it echoes the loss we feel daily, or something along those lines. She said. So when I don't even think that there she's talking about particularly like big cases of suffering, but just generally in day-to-day life, that sense that things are not as they could be. They're not. Things might be good, but they're not very good. They're not perfect. There's always something going on. There's always pain or suffering or some kind of issue. And I think she's kind of saying that Eden gives us this kind of an explanation for that there's a reason we look around and we feel, a certain sense of discontent with the way things are, whether it's our situation or the world around us. And it's because there was this thing there. So actually, rather than being a cruel thing, actually it's a helpful thing for us to have the Eden story. It gives us some explanation for why we feel this way, which perhaps, I think when we've had conversations, I suppose the conversation with the atheist is that in a sense that their problem is they don't have a problem with evil, or it's difficult to have a problem,
Right.
Whereas we can have a problem because we believe there is an Eden that was up here, and this is we're in a fallen state now. Whereas the atheist just has to say, well, this is just the way it is, so
Right.
get over it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Step one when you're addressing the problem of evil is to make sure it's a problem.
Mm.
And we don't even get off the ground if we can't establish that it's a problem. But why should it be a problem?
If you just want to do the Dawkins, like, at root, no good, no evil, those kind of things. I think that's the logical conclusion. I think Dawkins is absolutely bang on. If you're going to hold that position, but then you can't really turn around and say, hey, suffering is bad or it's wrong. You can say, I don't like it, it's unpleasant, but you can't really have a problem with it and say we need to stop these things or something.
Right. Yeah. If everything is random, nothing is wrong. But that's the first thing we feel about suffering, is that it's wrong. And that kind of brings us to the second story that we spoke to Wendy about, which was the fall. And, and again, every experience we have of suffering is an experience of fallenness. Cells are meant to multiply healthily. When it goes wrong, they multiply malignantly, and you get cancer. And you're meant to be healthy, but you fall from that, and there's disease. We feel like you're meant to have these harmonious relationships, and then they fall apart. And we're meant to live, and yet we die. Every experience of evil and suffering in this world is an experience of the fall. So again, you might think, oh, these ancient stories, and there's a magical tree, and there's a talking snake, and that these stories are of no earthy benefit to you. Actually, they are very gritty, because they actually name the fallenness of this world. And then we spoke about Job. So I mean, there's loads to say about Job, but Paul, what this could be a whole series of podcasts, but what does Job as a story teach us about suffering?
Well, she talks again early on about, I think she said her pastor rang her up and said, like, I feel like you're living story of Job. And I think she said, like, actually, like, this, despite the fact she'd been a Christian kind of all her life, or since very young, and she'd been through Bible college and stuff, she didn't really feel prepared still for all the suffering she was living through. And there was a sense of kind of like, well, I think you say it in your conversation with her. We talk about seasons sometimes being like, you have a season of suffering and stuff, and it just seemed for her that it was season after season after season. It was just ongoing, and she was a bit like, well, I don't understand this. But there was this sort of moment for her, I think, where looking at the story of Job, she realized that we all know the beginning of Job quite well, and we all know the end of Job quite well. But actually, the majority of Job is just this bit in the middle, where actually he's in the pit, he's at the bottom of it all, and it just goes on and on at that point. And
like 40 chapters almost, yeah.
Exactly.
From chapter 3 to chapter 38.
Yeah, and
all right, Job. All right, we get the idea. All right, keep it light.
But I think, for someone in Job's position, it must have been tricky. It must have been hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel, in a sense, if you want to use it like that, because it was just this non-stop, continuous thing, one thing after another, and then no way out for the foreseeable future. And actually, I think there's a sense in which when you go through Job, we can at least take we can take comfort, actually, if we're feeling like that. Actually, the Bible doesn't, it's not that the Bible doesn't talk to those situations. The Bible certainly has a whole book here where for 40 chapters or so, we have someone in that situation looking at it and kind of going, well, I don't really know what's going on. And, I don't, and no one seems to have the answers, and and all these things. And, obviously he's got his useless friends and stuff like that as well. Who just make things worse.
They do. They're very illuminating, I think, because like we all recognize them very, Eliphaz and Elihu, and there's three, and then Elihu comes along, and but this idea that they think that suffering happens only if you get stuff wrong. So if suffering has happened to Job, he must have got something wrong. And psychologically, we've all got a lot invested in the miserable comforter's philosophy, because we'd like to think that we are immune from Job's sufferings, if only we're clever enough and good enough. So we've got a lot invested in, like, people don't have patience with patients, right? It's something you sort of notice in healthcare. You know, we let people to be sick for a little bit, and we bring them the grapes in week 1. But if they're still ill in week 2, week 4, week 8, we lose patience with patients, because they are a rebuke to our theology of glory. And our theology of glory is, as long as we climb the ladder and do well enough in life, then that kind of suffering won't hit us. If suffering hits Job in spite of being righteous, well, that would mean that we live in a world in which the righteous can suffer. In which I could suffer, in which no matter how well I do in life, I could be brought down to the pit. And we're so terrified of that we end up actually persecuting sufferers for being in the pit for so long, because they remind us that this world is a terrifying place, and we don't want to be reminded about that. But of course, go.
No, I was going to say, and it seems, in one sense, suffering can look like just random, can't it? From when you see that's the thing, isn't it? Because unlike the friends, the friends think you must have done something, and it's not that it's random, because we know God is at work in things. But at least from our earthly perspective, I mean, we don't know. Who knows? Next week you wake up and you don't feel very well, and you find out you've got some terrible, illness that you're not going to recover from. Those things, none of us are guaranteed. None of us are guaranteed anything, are we? Basically,
right.
And that is, in a sense, what makes it difficult, I suppose, for people.
Yes.
And particularly knowing how to respond. Like, how do you sit with? I mean, what you say about you take the grapes in week 1, and then week 2, come on, like, there's some truth in that, isn't there? Obviously, that's probably a bit extreme, but it's hard to know, like, what are you supposed to say to the person who is just stuck in suffering with no, maybe no hope of, I was going to say recovery. That makes it sound like they're going to die. I'm not saying everyone's going to die, but
they are, though, Paul. They are.
Yeah.
I read
I mean, just someone whose life, who basically for the rest of their life, which may be a good long life, stuff is going to be really tough.
Right. How
do you sit with someone in that without ending up just saying the same platitudes as these guys, Job's friends?
Yes. Yeah, platitudes really reveal the kind of theology we have about suffering. Worse things happen at sea, or lightning never strikes twice, or things like this, which kind of, can minimize. And what we don't want to be heard as saying is, be careful of saying X, Y, and Z in any one situation, because that actually, any number of platitudes can actually be heartfelt and received warmly and really help people. And in some senses, if we're constantly worried that we'll say the wrong thing, we might not draw near to people in suffering. And that would be the worst thing. If we're so fearful of saying the wrong thing that we actually say nothing and make no approach to our suffering friends, that's far worse than coming in with a heart that is wanting to do good and maybe fumbling it, maybe getting it wrong. In one sense, presence with the sufferer is more important than whatever wisdom you can bring to them.
And it's that thing. Maybe you don't have to have an answer to it to mourn with those who mourn, and those kind of things, do you?
Right. Brené Brown's got that wonderful sort of analogy of, when you're in the pits, there are those who are, from up on high, who give you advice, and their advice, is usually, what does she say? She says it starts with 2 words. What does she say? basically, if you say, at least, those are the two words you should never use. She says, if someone has the miscarriage and you say to them, well, at least you've got two other children, I mean, does that help? Or Jimmy gets thrown out of school. You don't then say, well, at least Sarah is a straight A student. At least is a minimizing thing. It's again, it's what we constantly want to do because we don't want to think that life could be really terrible. So we're always going, at least worst things happen at sea. Lightning doesn't strike twice, at least. So we minimize, and we give advice from on high. And she says, true consolation and comfort comes when you go down into the pit with the person and say, me too. And of course, Jesus is exactly that kind of a God who doesn't just yell down from heaven and say, at least count your blessings. There is truth about counting your blessings, and there is truth about getting your suffering in perspective and all that. But that's not the ultimate hope. The ultimate hope is Christ joining us in the pit and saying, "Me too." And on the cross, my goodness, does he says, "Me too," in an amazing way. Brandon on Top Chat says, what strikes me about Job is the arbitrariness of any particular instance of suffering, but the profundity of the purpose of the suffering overall. You get those two layers, don't you? Job's constantly saying, why God? 20 times he asks God why, and he never receives an answer. But we know the answer as we read. There is an overarching purpose to all of this. But actually, Job enters into, and the experience of reading Job is the experience of entering into the suffering of one who doesn't know the end from the beginning, but just has to trust as he walks through that long, hard road.
And so, I'm just thinking about that there is a perspective thing, and there's the kind of, what was the words that Brandon used there? The profundity of the
profundity
purpose.
of
the purpose. Yeah, there's perspective and purpose. As like you say, it is good to get perspective in a sense, isn't it? So I think about this time we're in now, and I think it's a shame. I think personally, as I only speak for myself. It's a shame that I think so many Christians, the way we're viewing COVID and coronavirus is almost like it's the end of the world. Whereas my perspective is that I'm not saying it's not bad, but actually this is the way people have lived for the majority of human history, with these things hanging over them. Many people in the world today, or before 2020, even in modern day world, have lived in this kind of, with these things hanging over them, disease that they weren't sure they could get over and recover from and would escape. If anything, this is the blip. So the blip is what we've had, is the comfortable,
the 70 years post-war. Yeah,
exactly, of peace and generally kind of avoiding pandemic and sickness and those things. And I think, so it's good to have that perspective, because we can look at it and say, well, what, this isn't, we're not going through anything new in some ways here. Of course, what we can also, as Christians, we have the bigger picture. We might not necessarily know what the purpose is behind all this, but when I used to talk about suffering, I used to talk about like a Monet painting. Like if you've got a Monet painting and you're just up against it like that, and you're staring at this small patch, it's just going to be like a mess of paint, and you're not going to have any clue what's going on. And it's only when you're able to draw back from it and see the whole picture that it comes into focus, and you can see what's going on. And in God's mercy, stuff goes on in our lives where we've gone through those times where everything seems a mess and is painful and hard, and we've got some distance away from it, and we can see an element of the picture, the bigger picture. But there are, of course, things where we might never see the big picture until, not this side of, heaven. But I suppose for us, at least, we have the trust that there is this bigger picture that God is working in. That even the most profound and terrible of suffering has a purpose. And I suppose we see that on the cross above all, don't we?
Right. Yeah, that's the story to frame it all. That, yeah, Christ turned deicide into the greatest glory, and the greatest story that ever was. The killing of God ended up being the salvation of the world. You need to inhabit that story and to really believe that God is into turning crucifixions into resurrections. And if he did it in the grand story, he'll do it in my little story. Paige Wright asks the question, how do any of us prepare for suffering before we're in it? And in one sense, I want to answer, like, you almost can't, because there's a sense in which when you read about the long, dark night of the soul or something like that, you almost romanticize it, and you almost think, oh gosh, it sounds very interesting. It sounds like what an artist would go through, and and aren't the tortured artists the really interesting ones? And I remember like age 21, 22. I think I was 22, and I prayed this prayer from Philippians 3. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow to attain to the resurrection of the dead. And as I read about that, the fellowship of Christ's sufferings, I prayed in a very glib fashion. And I prayed, God, if I can know Christ better in suffering, then bring it on. Which, like, I look back and now I just think, like, you had no idea what you were praying for, did you? And within a week, the Home Office said I had to leave the country within 10 days' time or face £10,000 fine and 6 months in prison. And my girlfriend, who I was hoping to marry, said that she was actually seeing somebody else and she didn't want Jesus anymore. And I went home, and my parents were going through a very messy divorce, and there was some scandals going on in the church that I then joined, and like a whole bunch of things happened within just weeks of me praying, if I can know Jesus in suffering, then bring it on. And I think I imagined that, the long dark road, it sounds kind of intriguing and interesting. No, it sucks. Like, it's not interesting. It's not romantic.
No. And I had a similar thing with a friend of mine, actually, like from the States, who said, it had become not a glib thing, but like he'd prayed through that stuff, and and he said, like, man, if I'd known what would come of that, God, because I mean he had like two of his brothers took their own lives and stuff, and wow. He just went through such a time of pain and suffering, but so even in the midst of that, though, being able to kind of look at it and keep trusting, though. But that's the reality, isn't it? That we talked about it a bit last week, I suppose, with the John Bear stuff, that if as Christians we're called to take up our cross and die, I think, I just wonder whether sometimes we think that, like, the Christian life is basically going to be like fine, and then sometimes bad stuff happens to people, and some people get some really bad suffering, and the rest of us get a little bit every now and again, and so on.
Right.
But I mean, the picture Jesus gives of following him really is just like, yeah, come and die, like, come and suffer with me, like,
yeah.
And that's not it. Obviously, there's glory and joy, but I mean, I wonder whether we in the West we're just not prepared for that suffering side of it. We just don't. We basically think we can have all the comforts of Western middle class secularism, and have a kind of Christian sheen on the edge of it.
Yeah. And maybe I'll have 6 months of redundancy at one stage in my 20s, but by and large, life is on the up, Like it happens, like when I remember preparing to preach from Psalm 23, I listened to like dozens of sermons that people were preaching on Psalm 23, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And almost to a preacher, they were all saying, at some stage, you might walk through the valley of the shadow, and you need to be ready for that. You're like, I think the analogy is we're all walking through the valley that is overshadowed by death, and it's heading to that one destination. That's the road we're all on. But it was just fascinating to me that dozens of preachers, spending lots of time reading Psalm 23, were thinking, yes, some members of my church might at this stage be walking through the valley of the shadow, and they need to be ready, as opposed to
so like the shadow in the valley might be the odd surprising thing that comes up when actually it's the fact that there's light and hope, which should be the surprise.
A great comment on Top Chat. Stir and Fry has just asked if we're not suffering, is something wrong? Okay, if we're all walking through the valley of the shadow, if we're not feeling the shadow right now, is something wrong? And I guess I'd refer you back to the John Bear interview, where he kind of talks about, all of life is mortification, and all of life is pouring ourselves out for the neighbor, for others. So you might just have gotten promoted, and you might just have moved into the dream home, and you've just booked the dream holiday, and life is going well. It's not so much about whether the circumstances in your life are sunny or not, but it is about in that prosperity, what are you dying, right? Are you pouring out the life that you've been given? And maybe you have just inherited a dream home. Friends of mine have just inherited a dream home in the West Country, and what are they doing with it? Well, they're going to fix it up, but they're also going to offer it to people who really need a break, and pouring out the blessing that they have received. So, do you always need to be experiencing suffering? No, absolutely not. But you do always need to be pouring yourself out and using whatever blessings you have. And I think, and I'd say you need to be accompanying people on their journeys, people who are especially suffering right now. So 2 Corinthians chapter 1 comes to mind, where we are comforted in our sorrows so that we can comfort whoever we're walking with in their sorrows. So I think in two ways, you might be going through prosperity, but that prosperity is given so that you might pour it out, and B, you're meant to be accompanying people who are feeling the suffering very acutely right now. I think that's where I would go with that. And you know what? It's actually 2 minutes past 2. Gosh, doesn't time fly when you're talking about death and pain and struggle?
Hang on, sorry. There's a really Paige Wright has just said, and she said, I often think during my time of suffering, instead of why me, why not me? I think that's really interesting. I think this is what maybe this is one of the things I've been thinking about just recently, and particularly off the back of that John Bear thing the other week, just that, or the whole COVID thing. We're like, why is this happening to us? Well, why wouldn't it happen to us? Like, this is what the world is like. We've just been asleep to the fact that, the world is like this for so long now, that we've been ill prepared for it, even as Christians, let alone everyone else.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So do keep the questions rolling in, and can I share with you something really cool, guys, because we have
another rap.
I'd like to tell a story all about how my life got turned upside down. That's basically Psalm 23, isn't it? The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. It's a retelling. We are doing, in terms of storytelling, we are telling a great Christmas story again this year, and it's called Let Me Go There. And I'd love to show you just the initial few seconds of it and get you excited about it, because we need your help to make it. We basically need a whole bunch more computer hardware in order to make this story fly. And so let me just share screen about Christmas 2020 and see if you guys are able to help. Oh, no, because we can't have computer audio, can we? I forgot. Anyway, this year, it's going to be huge. Let Me Go There is the story of a father and son who go into a curiosity shop, and the son is drawn to a snow globe. And he looks closer at the snow globe, and there's this gnarled, weird, twisted tree. And standing in front of the tree, there is a boy. And unmistakably, the boy in the snow globe is the son. And he looks at this snow globe. He looks back to his dad. His dad is not surprised at this. His dad says, look closer. And as we look closer into the globe, we are joined, well, we join this strange dark world. And the big question is, does the sun want to enter this world? Will the sun commit himself to this world in order to turn it the right way up? And if you want to see the clip that I was about to share, you can go to letmegothere.info, and you can check out where we've got to on it. And it is a stunning animation done 3D by Rod March, who's got an electric back catalog. So do check that out. But if you can help us make it, we would really appreciate it. You can go to give.net/Christmas videos, give.net/Christmas videos. And we'd love your help in telling that story this Christmas. And Paul, what are some other ways that people can keep in touch with us? Oh, are you there, Paul?
Sorry, I was muted. Did you? Do you want to turn off this screen share?
Sure.
Yeah, it's so professional this week. Other ways people can keep in touch with us. Yeah, so obviously, if you're watching this on YouTube, do subscribe to the channel, hit the bell. That will keep you up to date with what's going on. But you can find us on Facebook and on Twitter and on Instagram under Speak Life UK. So do kind of give us likes and some follows on there. And then also, of course, you can always head to the website, speaklife.org.uk, and kind of find out all our stuff there. And if you want to know what's going on each week, then sign up to our weekly email at speaklife.org.uk/sign up.
Brilliant. And stay tuned. This week, we are having an interview with Rachel Gilson go up for Reset. And she's a fascinating figure. She went to Yale in the States, aged 18, and she identified as gay. She wanted to get married to a woman. She was an atheist. And then she stole a copy of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and through that got converted. And her story since then has been fascinating. And we talk about matters of sex and sexuality and the body and marriage and the gospel. And it's a really great interview. So please do stay tuned, 7 p.m. on Friday for the latest on Reset. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. And we will have ever more smooth technology next week, we promise. But until then, bye-bye.
All the best.
And then I'm going to switch off the stream.
Are we supposed to do the talking bit now?
Oh yeah, talking. I love Stir and Fry. I say, Glen, you're tiny. Thanks a lot, Stir and Fry.
Oh dear.